Sir, step back in the vehicle. Broken taillight.
Taillight's working just fine.
Back in the car now.
You might want to call your supervisor. Hold here. What's going on? Evening, Colonel. Sergeant.
Blue lights cut through the night air. A patrol cruiser rolled up behind a sedan with military plates. The officer stepped out with a flashlight and a hard voice. He claimed the taillight looked broken. The driver stepped out in a dress uniform with polished metals and a crisp jacket. His rank board showed Eagle insignia. The officer ignored it. He ordered the colonel to place his hands on the trunk. A second unit arrived and blocked the lane. Bodycams recorded every word. The colonel stayed calm while the officer pushed the stop forward without evidence. Moments later, a supervisor pulled in. He recognized the uniform, the name, and the face. The stop changed direction fast. That night left a record the officer never forgot. The highway stayed dark except for scattered truck headlights. Most traffic cleared out after sundown. The sedan with military plates drove in the right lane at a steady speed. Inside sat a colonel in dress uniform. He had finished a formal event at a base 2 towns away. His jacket stayed pressed. His ribbons lined across his chest. His nameplate sat straight under his rank. He drove toward home with quiet music and low headlights. A patrol cruiser hid near a highway exit sign. The officer inside watched license plates with a camera on his dash. The sedan passed. The camera beeped. The officer turned on his headlights and pulled out. He followed the sedan for a short distance. He turned on his blue lights. The sedan slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. Traffic rolled by at high speed. Wind pushed against the vehicles. The officer walked toward the driver's door with a flashlight. His tone sounded sharp. He accused the driver of a broken taillight. The colonel kept a calm voice. He explained that all lights worked when he left the base. The officer ignored the explanation. He ordered the colonel to step out. The colonel followed instructions. He kept his hands visible. The colonel stood near the trunk with steady posture. The officer looked over the uniform but did not slow down. He asked if the colonel drank alcohol. The colonel said no. His breath smelled clean. His speech stayed steady. The officer asked for license, registration, and proof of insurance. The colonel handed them over. The officer held the documents under his flashlight. He asked if the uniform was real. The colonel confirmed his identity. He stated his rank and unit. The officer paced back and forth. His voice grew louder. Traffic roared by. The colonel stayed in the same position. A second patrol cruiser pulled in behind the first. The second officer stepped out and watched from the passenger side of the sedan. He looked at the uniform. His expression shifted. He asked the first officer if they needed backup. The first officer waved him off. The colonel asked a simple question. Why was he pulled over if the taillight worked? The officer snapped back. He accused the colonel of arguing. He threatened to place him in handcuffs. The colonel raised both hands and stayed silent. Bodycams recorded each second. The colonel glanced at the patrol cruiser's mirror. He saw the camera light blinking. The first officer walked to the rear of the sedan and tapped on both taillights. They lit up under the flashlight beam. Nothing flickered. Nothing shattered. The second officer noticed it. He asked again if backup was needed. The first officer ignored him and accused the colonel of defiance. The second officer crossed his arms and watched. A long pause settled over the scene. The officer ordered the colonel to place his hands on the trunk. The colonel complied. He did not resist. The officer patted him down. No weapons. No contraband. The colonel stood still. The officer asked if the colonel threatened him. The colonel said nothing. He stared straight ahead and waited. Traffic thickened near the exit. A large truck slowed as it passed. The truck driver stared at the scene. The colonel's uniform caught his eye. The truck continued down the road. The first officer called for a supervisor. His voice sounded tense. The second officer raised his eyebrows. He stepped back toward his cruiser and leaned against the hood. He folded his arms and waited. 5 minutes later, a supervisor unit pulled up behind them. The sergeant stepped out. He saw the uniform first. His face changed. He approached the colonel with respect and asked what happened. The first officer spoke fast. He accused the colonel of resisting questions, hiding evidence, and refusing orders. The sergeant did not respond. He turned his flashlight on the taillights. Both lights stayed bright and steady. The sergeant then asked the colonel if he had been drinking. The colonel shook his head. He explained his evening at the base event. The sergeant listened without interruption. The second officer stayed silent. The first officer paced around and mumbled under his breath. The sergeant asked for the colonel's documents. He stepped to his cruiser and ran a full check. The screen showed a clean record. The colonel's driver's license stood clear. Registration matched the owner. No tickets. No prior stops. No suspensions. The sergeant returned the documents. The sergeant turned to the first officer. His voice lowered. He asked why the stop occurred. The first officer repeated the broken taillight claim. The sergeant shook his head. He pointed his flashlight again at the taillights. Both shined without issue. The first officer froze. His shoulders dropped. The sergeant apologized to the colonel. He asked him to wait a moment. He pulled the first officer toward the front of the patrol cruiser. The bodycam caught their conversation. The sergeant asked why he removed the colonel from the car. The first officer said the uniform looked suspicious. The sergeant stared at him. He asked if that was a lawful reason. The first officer did not answer. The sergeant told the second officer to check the dash camera footage. They reviewed the start of the stop. The sedan had driven normal. No weaving. No speeding. No signal violation. Nothing to justify the lights. The sergeant's breathing slowed. He knew the stop was false. The sergeant returned to the colonel and apologized again. He returned the documents and said the colonel was free to leave. The colonel thanked him but did not smile. He walked back to the driver's seat and sat in silence. He placed both hands on the wheel and waited. The sergeant pulled the first officer aside again. He said they needed a written report for internal review. The first officer protested. He said it was a harmless stop. The sergeant disagreed. He reminded him that body cams captured every moment. He reminded him that the colonel followed every order. The officer argued. The sergeant shut him down. The colonel started his car. He rolled slowly back onto the highway. He watched the patrol cars fade in his rearview mirror. The radio in the cruiser crackled. The sergeant reported the stop as cleared. He requested a review in the morning. The first officer sat in his patrol seat and slammed the door. His face looked tense. He stared at the wheel and stayed silent. The colonel reached his home 40 minutes later. He parked in his driveway and sat still. He replayed the stop in his mind. He replayed each order, each demand, and each false claim. He stepped out and unlocked his front door. His family slept. He hung his uniform in the hallway closet and placed his hat on a shelf. He sat at the kitchen table and took a slow breath. The next day, Internal Affairs requested all footage from the stop. The sergeant submitted body cam files. The second officer submitted his as well. The first officer hesitated. He walked into the supervisor's office and complained that the stop was routine. The supervisor told him to hand over the footage. The first officer pushed back. The supervisor did not give him a choice. When Internal Affairs reviewed the video, the situation became clear. The officer lied about the taillight. He pulled the colonel from the car without cause. He threatened arrest with no grounds. The colonel stayed calm. The timeline left no room for defense. The department flagged the file. The colonel received a phone call 3 days later from the sergeant. The sergeant apologized again. He said the department began an investigation. He said the stop should not have happened. The colonel thanked him. He did not ask for details. He hung up and walked into the living room. He turned on the TV and sat quietly. The first officer was called into a meeting with command staff. He sat across from a table of supervisors and internal affairs. They played the body cam footage. The room stayed silent. When the recording ended, they asked him to explain his actions. His excuses broke apart fast. The footage left no space for false claims. The department placed him on administrative leave. His badge and weapon stayed locked in the station armory. The Internal Affairs investigator prepared a formal report. The police chief received the file and signed off on disciplinary hearings. The outcome would reach public record. The sergeant met with the colonel in person to explain the next steps. He shook his hand and thanked him for staying calm. The colonel nodded. He said officers have a hard job. He said respect runs both ways. He said he trusted the process. That night, the department issued a short press release. It stated that a false traffic stop took place. It stated that Internal Affairs took action. The statement did not include the colonel's name. It did not include full details, but it confirmed that the officer would face discipline. The colonel read the press release online. He closed the browser and turned off his computer. He did not seek attention. He did not file a lawsuit. He had served long enough to know that some lessons take time. The truth traveled through the department faster than anger ever could. The highway stayed quiet for a few nights after the stop. Officers patrolled with better focus. Supervisors checked their cams twice before ending each shift. The sergeant reminded them again. Stops needed facts, not guesses. And the colonel went back to his life. Sunlight filled the station lobby the next morning. Officers lined up for roll call. The sergeant stood near the podium. His voice sounded firm. He told the shift about the false stop. He reminded everyone that every action carried weight. He pointed to the camera on his chest. Eyes shifted toward the first officer who stood in the back row. His gaze stayed on the floor. After roll call, the first officer met with his union representative. They sat in a small room near the records section. The union representative asked for his side of the story. The officer said the colonel's uniform unsettled him. He said the driver looked nervous. He said the taillight flickered. The representative watched his face. He saw doubt. He saw stress. He saw excuses. Internal Affairs requested a written statement. The officer typed one page. He tried to defend his actions. He blamed darkness. He blamed glare from headlights. He blamed stress. Internal Affairs read each line. The report did not match the bodycam footage. They wrote notes on the margin of each paragraph. The sergeant met with the second officer. He asked if he saw any real violation. The second officer said no. He said the sedan drove normal. He said the colonel followed orders. He said the stop lacked grounds. He handed over his report. The sergeant thanked him. The department commander reviewed the case file. He read the reports. He watched the footage again. He held his chin in his hand and stayed silent. He had served for decades. He knew false stops damaged trust. He signed orders for a formal discipline hearing. The first officer would face the board within a week. The colonel sat in his office at the base. His desk had a few folders, a pen, and a framed photo. He tried to focus on paperwork, but his thoughts returned to the stop. He had dealt with heated moments in service, but the traffic stop felt different. He had been judged on sight. He had been ordered out with no reason. He had been searched with no cause. Around noon, his commander called him in. The commander asked how he was holding up. The colonel said he was fine. The commander handed him a copy of the department's press release. The colonel read it in silence. He nodded. He passed the paper back. His commander said the department thanked him for maintaining calm. The colonel shrugged. He said anger would have made things worse. That evening, the sergeant visited the colonel's house with prior approval. He wore his uniform and hat. The colonel opened the door. The sergeant apologized in person. He admitted the stop lacked sense. He explained the next steps. The colonel listened. He accepted the apology. He did not push for extra action. He said he trusted the system. The sergeant thanked him and walked away. Back at the station, Internal Affairs compiled every detail. They included timestamps, commands, dash camera logs, and radio traffic. They confirmed no violation from the sedan. They confirmed the taillight worked. They confirmed the colonel obeyed orders without delay. The file grew thick. They prepared it for the discipline board. The first officer's family noticed his stress. He sat at the kitchen table in silence. He tapped his fingers on the wood. His wife asked what happened. He said nothing. He stared at his badge in his palm. For the first time, he wondered if his mindset caused the problem. He tried to push the thought away. He failed. The next morning, media reporters requested more details. The department declined. They wanted to finish the internal process first. Reporters called the base and asked for the colonel's name. Base personnel refused to release it. The colonel did not respond to any requests. He wanted peace, not coverage. The first officer drove to the station parking lot. Cameras from a local news crew waited near the entrance. He walked past with a stiff jaw. He entered the building and sat outside the chief's office. The chief called him inside. The officer stood across from the desk. The chief clarified the stakes. He said the stop lacked sense. He said public trust mattered. He said the badge required discipline and restraint. The officer listened with a blank stare. The chief dismissed him without further conversation. The discipline board assembled later that week. A long table filled the room. The commander sat in the center. Internal Affairs sat to the left. The first officer and his union representative sat to the right. A clerk recorded the meeting. The board reviewed the footage. They paused at key moments. They watched the taillights glow red on the shoulder. They watched the colonel stand still while insults flew at him. They watched the officer threaten arrest with no cause. When the footage ended, the commander asked the officer to respond. His voice cracked. He said stress clouded his mind. He said he misread the situation. He said he feared a hidden threat. The commander asked if he had any basis for that fear. The officer stayed silent. The commander asked again. Silence hung in the room. Internal Affairs read the list of violations. False statements, unlawful removal from a vehicle, threat of arrest without grounds, search without cause. The union representative tried to defend him. The board listened. They weighed every word. They held a short recess. When they returned, they delivered the decision. The first officer lost his patrol duties. He lost his field assignments. He would work in records until further notice. He would receive mandatory training on traffic stop procedures. He would face a short suspension. And the board placed a permanent mark in his file. The officer lowered his head. His union representative placed a hand on his shoulder. The sergeant watched from the hallway. He did not celebrate. He wanted fairness, not revenge. The second officer nodded from the corner. He knew the outcome fit the evidence. News traveled fast through the station. Officers spoke in quiet tones near the coffee pot. Some blamed the first officer. Some blamed stress. Some blamed lack of judgment. But no one argued the truth. The footage showed everything. Later that day, the colonel received a short email from the sergeant. It said the internal process finished. It thanked him again for remaining calm. The colonel read the message. He closed the email program. He picked up his folder and returned to work. A week passed. The colonel planned for a training event on base. He met with younger soldiers. He explained leadership and discipline. He told them that rank meant responsibility. He told them that calm minds made clear decisions. He never mentioned the stop. He never mentioned the officer. He held his standards without giving speeches about his own experience. At the police station, the first officer sat in the records room. He filed incident reports in metal cabinets. The room smelled like paper and dust. He stared at a stack of forms. He tried to ignore the feeling in his stomach. He knew he had crossed a line. He had judged on sight. He had acted with no proof. That truth would not leave him. One afternoon, the colonel drove through the same highway where the stop occurred. His taillights glowed bright behind him. A patrol cruiser passed in the opposite lane. No one followed him. The road felt quiet. The sky stayed clear. He reached his exit and headed home. Back at the station, the chief issued a training order. Every officer in the department attended a refresher. The sergeant stood at the front of the classroom. He reviewed legal grounds for stops. He reviewed respectful communication. He reviewed officer safety without prejudice. Officers asked no questions. They took notes and listened. At the end of the session, the sergeant reminded them that bodycams recorded everything. He told them that footage protected honest officers and exposed reckless ones. He ended the training without drama. The commander later thanked the sergeant for handling the ordeal. He said the case would remain on record. He said the department learned from it. He said change needed clear rules, not slogans. The colonel returned to his routine. He visited the gym. He prepared equipment lists. He checked units for readiness. He finished paperwork in the evenings. He did not dwell on the stop. Weeks later, the first officer requested a meeting with the chief. He wanted to explain himself again. He sat across from the desk and apologized. The chief listened. He did not interrupt. When the officer finished, the chief thanked him for speaking. He did not promise anything. He ended the meeting and sent him back to records. Months passed. The first officer kept his head down. He did not seek attention. He did not argue with co-workers. He tried to show improvement. One morning, the sergeant visited him in the records room. He asked how he was doing. The officer shrugged. The sergeant told him that discipline was not the end of a career unless he let it be. The officer nodded. The sergeant walked away. Across town, the colonel sat on his porch on a warm night. He drank water from a glass and listened to the crickets. He had seen enough conflict in service to know when to speak and when to stay quiet. He closed his eyes and let the day fade. The department never released his name. They never revealed specific details about him. They only confirmed that the stop was wrongful. The public respected the privacy. Reporters moved on. In time, the story became a lesson inside the station. New rookies watched the footage during training. Instructors pointed out each mistake. They explained how quick assumptions led to bad choices. They explained how calm drivers deserved calm responses. The video became a tool, not a scandal. The colonel continued his service. He led soldiers with steady judgment. He never spoke of the stop. He never demanded special treatment again. His uniform stayed pressed. His ribbons lined straight. His rank stayed clear, and somewhere in the records room the first officer understood that every action on the street left a mark. That mark stayed longer than a complaint, longer than a written warning, longer than a report. It stayed in the culture of the station. It stayed in the minds of the officers who watched him fail. The camera never blinked. The station's next training cycle started on a Monday morning. New recruits arrived from the academy. They formed a line in the hallway outside the briefing room. Their uniforms looked clean. Their boots shined. They waited in silence. The sergeant reviewed the roster. He marked each name on his clipboard. When he finished, he opened the door and ordered everyone inside. The recruits sat at long tables. A projector screen filled the front wall. The sergeant played the bodycam footage without warning. The screen showed the false stop from start to finish. Each recruit watched the colonel step out of the sedan. They heard the officer order him to the trunk. They saw the second officer stand beside the car. They heard the officer accuse the colonel of hiding weapons. They saw the search take place with no cause. When the footage ended, the sergeant stepped forward. His voice sounded clear. He explained the policy for traffic stops. Every stop needed proof. Every order needed legal grounds. Every search required consent or a legal standard. The recruits wrote notes. No one laughed. No one tried to defend the officer's choices. They knew the footage showed the truth. During a break, one recruit whispered to another. He asked why the first officer did not ask questions before ordering the colonel to step out. The second recruit shook his head. He said fear of authority made weak decisions worse. The sergeant heard them. He walked over and reminded them to avoid assumptions. He told them to think before speaking on a stop. He told them to follow training instead of ego. After the training, the recruits moved to the garage. Patrol vehicles lined the floor. The instructors showed them emergency lights, radios, and safety equipment. They demonstrated seat placement and camera activation. The recruits listened without distraction. They knew the lesson went deeper. The footage from the first officer served as a warning. Mistakes echoed inside the department for months. While the recruits trained, the colonel prepared for a field exercise on base. His unit planned a convoy inspection. He met with squad leaders and reviewed procedures. He spoke calmly. His words carried weight. Soldiers responded with respect. The colonel cared about order. He cared about discipline. He cared about dignity. His leadership style showed it. Around midday, his commander entered the room. He handed the colonel a sealed envelope. The department sent a letter of formal apology through official channels. The colonel opened it. The message repeated the same sentiment the sergeant delivered in person. It expressed regret. It thanked him for his conduct. It promised improved training. The colonel placed the letter in his desk drawer. He returned to planning the convoy inspection. At the station, the first officer sat behind a stack of reports. He worked in silence. Each file came from patrol units that responded to real calls. He filed reports about stolen property, noise complaints, and domestic disputes. He stamped dates. He added case numbers. His mind wandered back to the stop. He remembered the moment the colonel stepped out. He remembered the threat he issued. He remembered the supervisor's voice when he arrived. His shift ended at 4. He walked out to the lot and sat in his car. He stayed there for several minutes. His badge sat on the passenger seat. He stared at it. He wondered how many people lost trust in him. He wondered if his career still had value. He turned the key and drove home. That night, he watched the bodycam footage again on his work laptop. He paused the video before the colonel stepped out. He studied the taillights. Both lights glowed red. Nothing flickered. The footage hurt to watch. He pressed play again. He saw himself accuse the colonel of hiding weapons. He heard his own voice. He heard his anger. He watched the search. Shame settled in his chest like a heavy stone. He closed the laptop and leaned back. His wife entered the room. She asked if work went fine. He nodded without speaking. She sat beside him and rested her hand on his arm. He stayed silent. She sensed the tension but did not press him. He stared forward and tried to breathe. The next morning, the sergeant sent officers into field training with recruits. The first officer remained in the records room. He did not complain. He did not protest. He accepted the assignment. He placed each file into its slot in silence. A week later, the commander scheduled a department-wide meeting. He addressed every officer in person. The meeting took place in the largest training room. Officers filled the chairs. Detectives stood in the back. Dispatchers and civilian staff lined the walls. The commander spoke for 20 minutes. He reminded them of legal standards. He reminded them that courtesy protected both sides. He insisted on calm voices and professional commands. He displayed short clips from other stops across the state. Some officers handled tense drivers with patience. Others created conflict with aggressive language. He made it clear which approach the department would follow. The message spread through the room with force. No one interrupted. No one complained. The chief stood next. He addressed the incident without naming the colonel. He stated that a wrongful stop took place. He said the department handled discipline. He said training improved. He said the case stood closed. Officers nodded. Some glanced toward the back where the first officer sat alone. After the meeting ended, the second officer walked over to him. He asked if he felt all right. The first officer paused. He said he needed time. The second officer told him to keep focus and move forward. He offered to help if support felt needed. The first officer thanked him. He appreciated the gesture. Later that week, the colonel visited town for errands. He walked through a grocery store with a short list in his hand. A man near the checkout line recognized him. The man thanked him for serving. The colonel shook his hand and smiled. No one mentioned the traffic stop. The colonel did not bring it up. During the drive back to base, a patrol cruiser passed him on the highway. The cruiser did not slow. It did not lock on his bumper. It kept moving. The colonel relaxed his shoulders and rolled down his window to let fresh air inside. The breeze felt calm. The road ahead stayed open. At the station, the first officer finished his suspension. He returned to duty in records. The sergeant reviewed his progress. His work stayed neat. His attitude stayed controlled. He asked few questions. He avoided arguments. The sergeant noted the change in behavior. One evening, the officer wrote a private letter to the colonel. He apologized in simple terms. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He only said he was sorry. He placed the sealed letter in the station mailbox. The department forwarded it to the base. The colonel received it days later. He opened it and read the message. He placed the letter beside the official apology in his desk. He did not respond. He did not need to. The apology stood on its own. Months passed. Winter came. Snow piled near station walls. Officers drove slower. Stops became rare. The colonel worked through long weeks of preparation for a deployment exercise. He led planning meetings. He inspected vehicles. He coordinated training. The first officer continued his work in records. He kept a low profile. He showed patience toward co-workers. He never raised his voice. He finished tasks without complaint. The sergeant told him that discipline taught lessons no classroom could offer. The officer nodded and returned to his desk. One afternoon, a new recruit approached him. The recruit had seen the footage during training. He asked how officers stayed calm on tense stops. The first officer answered with a slow breath. He said they must think before speaking. He said they must respect the driver. He said they must control their voice. The recruit listened. He recognized the weight behind those words. At the base, the colonel met with soldiers for an after-action review. They discussed teamwork and accountability. He ended the meeting by reminding them that respect protects both sides in uncertain moments. He planned the next exercise and moved on. The story of the stop never returned to headlines. No public fight unfolded. No lawsuits formed. The footage stayed on record. The department kept it as training material. Officers learned. Recruits learned. The first officer learned the hard way. Life moved forward. Patrol cars rolled through streets. Radios buzzed. Calls for service kept coming. The colonel continued his duty. The officer remained in records. The second officer patrolled without drama. The sergeant led with steady judgment. The camera never blinked. The lesson stayed permanent. Spring brought warm weather back to the county. The station replaced snow tires on patrol vehicles. Officers prepared for increased traffic during holiday weekends. The sergeant reviewed schedules and assigned shifts across the district. The first officer stayed in records, but he worked with more focus than before. He volunteered for extra filing. He helped civilian staff organize storage bins. He stayed calm with every task. The colonel prepared for the convoy exercise on base. Trucks lined the motor pool. Mechanics checked brakes, signals, and communications gear. The colonel inspected each vehicle. He spoke with every driver. He expected precision. Soldiers adjusted straps and secured cargo. By noon, the motor pool reached full readiness. The convoy rolled out on schedule. The colonel rode in the lead vehicle. A military police truck followed at the rear. Civilian traffic moved aside as the convoy passed through town. Drivers slowed and watched the long line of trucks cross the main road. Everything stayed smooth until they reached a four-way stop near the county courthouse. A patrol cruiser sat near the corner. The first officer sat behind the wheel. He watched the convoy move through the intersection. Each driver obeyed traffic signs. Each truck maintained spacing. The first officer recognized the lead vehicle. He saw the colonel in the passenger seat. He took a slow breath. He did not react with fear or anger. He stayed composed. The convoy cleared the intersection. The colonel looked out the side window. He saw the cruiser parked near the courthouse steps. He recognized the officer behind the wheel. The colonel held no resentment. He nodded once and looked forward. Later in the afternoon, the sergeant scheduled a meeting with the first officer. They walked into a small office with plain chairs and blank walls. The sergeant reviewed his performance in records. He explained that the department observed improvement. He said his patience increased. He said his conduct stayed controlled. The officer thanked him. He said little else. The sergeant informed him that he would remain in records until further notice. He reminded him that trust moved slow. The officer understood. Across town, the colonel held a briefing after the convoy inspection. His soldiers reported smooth movement with no safety issues. He dismissed the group and walked toward his office. His secretary handed him a business card left by a local resident. The card thanked him for his service. The colonel placed it in his drawer without comment. He returned to his paperwork. Days passed. The first officer completed his records assignment for the week. He asked the sergeant if he could attend more training sessions. The sergeant approved. He signed him up for communication and de-escalation workshops. The officer sat in the front row. He listened to instructors speak about patience, restraint, and balanced language. He took detailed notes. He stayed silent until instructors opened the floor. When he spoke, he asked direct questions about command structure and officer safety. His tone stayed neutral. The instructors gave clear answers. After class, the first officer walked to the break room. Another officer poured coffee and asked how training went. The first officer said the sessions helped. The other officer nodded. He told him to keep steady progress and stop thinking about past events. The first officer agreed. He took his cup and returned to work. At the base, the colonel visited a training site where soldiers practiced casualty care. He monitored their performance in the field. He pointed out small mistakes. He praised fast responses. He wanted his soldiers ready for any situation. His leadership stayed calm and consistent. He did not waste words. Soldiers respected his clarity. Later that evening, the colonel drove off base to pick up groceries. The traffic lights flashed yellow at a quiet intersection. A patrol cruiser approached from the cross street. The cruiser slowed and turned left. The colonel recognized the unit number printed on the rear bumper. It matched the one driven by the sergeant. The cruiser did not react to the base vehicle. The sergeant continued his patrol without pause. The colonel admired the professionalism. He drove home in silence. At the station, the first officer finished another week of tasks. The sergeant met with him again. He explained that an opening for limited patrol duties would arrive in the next month. The first officer did not smile. He nodded. He told the sergeant he would earn back trust. The sergeant said he expected nothing less. The officer left the room with a sense of direction. The colonel received a message from his commander. The county requested military participation in a community safety event. Base leadership approved. The colonel agreed to attend. The event would include officers from the station. No one felt tension about it. The officer involved in the stop would not be present. The colonel supported the event. He believed cooperation between agencies built stability. A large crowd gathered at the town park on the day of the event. Military vehicles and patrol cars lined a wide lot. Families walked through display tents and equipment tables. Soldiers handed out small flags. Officers greeted children and showed them patrol cars. The sergeant stood near the main tent. He saw the colonel approach and nodded. The colonel nodded back. Both men understood the importance of the moment. Respect replaced tension. A reporter from a local paper moved through the park. She recognized the colonel and asked if he wanted to speak on record about base community coordination. He agreed. His statement stayed short. He praised cooperation. He praised clear communication between agencies. He thanked the public for supporting service members and first responders. He left the interview and returned to the crowd. At the station, the first officer continued with training assignments. He studied policy manuals and watched footage of positive stops across the state. He wrote short reports about what officers did well. He learned from each example. He focused on calm voices, steady posture, and lawful steps. He looked different from the man who shouted at the colonel. His voice lost its edge. His movements slowed. He carried himself with more control. A month later, the sergeant approved his request for limited patrol duty. The officer would drive with a supervisor during each shift. He joined a senior officer on a night patrol. Traffic stayed light. Calls remained quiet. The officer handled a simple traffic violation with clear words and basic instructions. The driver responded with respect. The supervisor noted improvement in his report. In the following weeks, the officer continued to show progress. He issued warnings without escalation. He checked identification and returned documents with calm explanations. He never raised his voice. He never pointed to a weapon. He followed policy step by step. The supervisor signed off on each patrol shift with no negative comments. The colonel heard about the officer's return to patrol through a short message from the sergeant. The colonel nodded when he read it. He held no anger. He closed the email and returned to his tasks. He believed in discipline. He believed in structure. He believed in learning through action. As summer neared, the department scheduled a public briefing to present updated stop procedures. The chief outlined new guidelines for documentation. He clarified that every officer must state the reason for a stop before asking for documents. He reinforced the rule that searches required lawful grounds. The policy applied to everyone, regardless of rank, background, or occupation. The first officer attended that meeting in the back row. He listened in silence. He knew the policy existed before his mistake. He understood that he failed to honor it. He accepted that the updated briefing marked a second chance for many. He refused to waste it. 2 weeks later, the colonel spoke at a leadership panel on base. He addressed younger officers about responsibility during tense moments. He told them that leadership meant restraint. He told them that respect built safer outcomes. His words reached every soldier in the room. The panel ended with a round of applause. The colonel left the room and walked back to his office. His day continued without pause. Months passed without incident. The first officer slowly regained credibility. He never returned to his old attitude. He approached each stop with caution. He logged each detail with discipline. He answered questions with respect. The sergeant monitored his progress and saw consistency. The colonel continued his duties without dwelling on the past. He visited training sites. He reviewed reports. He met with senior leadership. He prepared for future missions. His daily life remained steady. The false stop became a quiet memory inside the department. Officers remembered the footage. Recruits learned from it. The first officer lived with it. The colonel moved forward without public attention. The sergeant treated it as a lesson. Body cameras recorded each shift. Policies stayed clear. Respect returned. The camera never blinked. The lesson stayed permanent. Another officer pushed authority too far. Another camera told the truth. The road changed that night, and no badge erased the record. If you want the next story, stay alert. The next video drops soon, and it hits even harder. Before you go, get the free guide on recording police encounters with lawful precision. It explains rights, safe actions, and smart steps during a stop. It protects drivers and officers. Claim it and stay informed.